we really don't want this place to be precious. We want if the cyclists from around the corner are coming in and wheel the bikes in and lean them against the wall without, that being, feeling weird or feeling uncomfortable. That sympathy for where you are and who you're there for is really important.
Today on Dirty Linen, we are talking about the world of coffee, something that I am very passionate about every single day. We are talking to Tim Stiles. He is someone who's been integral to the specialty coffee push in Australia and also in the UK. Tim, welcome to Dirty Linen.
Thanks for having me.
I'm really thrilled to have you here. I think I need to start by asking you what kind of coffee you like to start the day with.
That's a good question. Generally, I'll start the day with filter coffee off the batch brewer in the roastery, because my days have been starting pretty early the last little while, and that's the one that's ready to go. Before that, I would always brew coffee at home in the morning, just on a really simple pour over, nice and easy. The quality of the beans is much more important than the brewer itself. So, we keep it pretty simple.
Interesting. And what coffee beans and what style of roast are you loving at the moment?
Right now, we're pretty much at the tail end of the East African coffee season. So we are really just working our way through the last of what's really fresh out of Ethiopia and Kenya. So right now, I've been drinking a lot of our Kenyan roasts, and in that bittersweet moment where almost like, kind of the end of summer, when the tomatoes are just starting to drop off a little bit. That's where we're at with Kenyan coffee right now. There's only probably 2 or 3 more months, I'd say, where they're going to be really good.
I mean, even as you say that, I just realised that this is going to be a mind-blowing conversation, because I reckon 99% of people would never think of coffee as a seasonal product. I mean, what are some of the things that we don't think about when we're drinking coffee that you think we should? That's
a huge list. So I'll try and be quite concise with it. I do think the seasonality thing is a huge one, and there are a lot of roasters in Australia that have been doing a lot of great work around, I think, communicating the fact that coffee is seasonal. That's a really big one. I think one of the things that we sort of try and talk to our team about a lot and help our team understand is the difference between coffee, the drink, and coffee, the ingredient. And, we sell cups of coffee that are finished products, and then we also sell bags of coffee, and trying to get people to understand that that a bag of coffee is not a finished product, but that's an ingredient that you need to take home and prepare, and how you need to, I think, communicate differently based upon that versus just handing somebody a finished drink that they're going to sip at.
I noticed also one of your recent tweets was around, the I guess, political and social situation in Ethiopia, and just sort of suggesting that if people are enjoying some Ethiopian coffee, why don't you just perhaps learn a little bit about what's happening in that country at the moment? I mean, do you think that we're supposed to be all about produce and origins and, farm to plate these days? I mean, do you feel like there's still quite a way to go with coffee?
Unfortunately, there is. Yeah, I think because it's, the places where coffee is grown are so far away from us here in Melbourne or really anywhere in Australia. And so the opportunity for baristas to connect to coffee producers is very, very limited. The first time I ever went to a coffee farm, all the steps of the process really connected in my mind, and I got a much more holistic view of coffee and a better understanding of coffee and the depths of that supply chain. But that's a really, really difficult thing to communicate and to understand if you don't get to experience it. So I think, unfortunately, most baristas and even a lot of roasters in Australia just haven't had the opportunity to get below the surface of coffee. And I think our understanding of coffee is pretty out of context from, like that tweet that you're referencing about the situation in Tigray. And yeah, it's hard to get your head around what's going on there if you don't have any connection to it at all.
I mean, part of me now is starting to think, to my own alarm, that maybe we shouldn't even be drinking coffee in Australia. I mean, talk me out of that.
I run through the same thing a lot of times. There's a lot of conflict, for me personally, around, it's really hard to do coffee with 100% confidence that everyone in that supply chain is being paid fairly and being treated fairly. Even if you're at the farms, you can see what's happening, but you have to work very, very hard to get below the surface to understand who's getting paid what and who owns what and those sorts of things. So I think that's a very sort of in tune concern to have. And I guess the flip side for me is if everyone just pulls out and says, well, we're just not going to do coffee because it's too difficult to work out and there's too much uncertainty, then you've got the livelihoods of literally millions of people around the world that dry up instantly. And in a lot of those communities, coffee may be the only cash crop that they're producing. Everything else may be subsistence farming. And if you then take away the only thing that you can actually exchange for cash, there are no school fees to be paid, books to be bought for kids, all the things that we almost take for granted here, they dry up pretty much instantly.
Yeah, I mean, it is very fraught, isn't it? Because I suppose, you can apply those same kinds of arguments to any kind of economic sanctions that you apply around the world, to any country, any situation. Of course, people are going to be harmed if the money doesn't flow in, but if the money isn't flowing ethically, then it's just really problematic.
Yeah, I think like the Myanmar situation not that long ago was, a good example of that, where, there were political issues in Myanmar and calls for boycotts and sanctions, and the only people who are getting hurt by those sanctions are farmers and producers and, people much further down the supply chain than the people that you're trying to impact. And yeah, I can't really see that that's the right way to go about it. And that's, I guess, the same dichotomy that we think about in terms of how do we buy coffee in a way that's as responsible as we can be, especially being in Australia and especially being under travel restrictions. That makes those transactions significantly harder to do with the kind of transparency or insight that we'd like to have in them.
It's so big. I remember a couple of years ago I wrote a big feature article about coffee and, whether the price of coffee was too low, which, we can probably quickly agree is the case. But I really just, from you're in it for your life. Like I was just deep in it for a few months, but it became so quickly evident how complex it is as an industry. It touches every country. The supply chain is so complex. And, I think one of the things that I found hardest to get my head around was the fact that coffee was traded as a commodity, which feels like it instantly makes it so disconnected from these largely micro farmers that actually grow the beans. Can you just explain the commodity side of coffee trade?
I can explain it to the extent that I understand it, and I'll caveat it with the fact that there are a lot of people a lot more educated on this and in tune with this than I am, who'll probably, tear their hair out at my inaccuracies. But, essentially, like coffee, until reasonably recently, coffee was basically traded as a commodity, and it was assumed that a cup of coffee was a cup of coffee, or a kilo of coffee beans were a kilo of coffee beans, and they were pretty much interchangeable. It didn't really matter where they came from, as long as they weighed a kilo and they produced a cup of coffee at the end. And there was a big breakaway from that not too long ago, where people started wanting to be more closely connected to the people who were producing the particular coffees, and being able to keep unique coffees out of these bulk commodity huge lots. So, essentially, if you are a farmer who's producing 150 kilos to 200 kilos a year, and your coffee is incredibly good, but it gets bulked in with a container of, another 15,000 kilos of coffee, what's special and unique about that coffee is completely lost. So that's really where the industry sort of diverged into two different streams, with bulk commodity coffee being the generic stuff that's all around and everywhere, and then the specialty coffee being the more specific, understandable, traceable coffee from particular origins with its own particular characteristics. The commodity market still affects the specialty market in terms of price, and we're actually seeing some huge issues around that right now, with the commodity price of coffee going through the roof, and that's having a big knock-on effect for the special coffee, the stuff that you'd be more familiar with drinking in a Melbourne cafe.
And just to continue on the huge issues that impact and intersect with coffee, we can't really talk about coffee farming without talking about climate change. I mean, it's, some places that have been fantastic for growing coffee are less so, or they're impacted by severe weather events. I mean, how are you seeing that impact what you do? I think one of the bigger impacts that we're seeing is that coffee farming is just getting harder, and there's fewer incentives to keep doing it. So I know that there's a number of roasters in Australia that have been really championing this message for a long time, around climate change especially, but I guess also climate change connected to what we're prepared to pay for coffee, because, you can overcome a lot of challenges if there's a financial incentive to do so. But if there isn't, you change businesses, and it's exactly the same as anyone changing jobs, whether you're a chef or a barista or whatever role you're in. If there's a financial incentive for you to change, you probably will. With the changing climate, what we're generally seeing is that the really good coffee growing areas are getting smaller, because they tend to be at altitude, and mountains tend to get skinnier towards the top. It's almost a prerequisite of being a mountain. And as it gets warmer, we're seeing that the lower altitude parts of those coffee farms are not able to produce coffee of the same standard that they were. They're much more susceptible to leaf rust and to other issues. And so literally, as you have to go further up the mountain, your land area gets smaller. That's sort of on one side, where there's a decreasing physical space to produce the coffee that's required. And then I think we also see, not necessarily connected to climate change, but more just connected to a general societal shift, is that there's a lot of urban sprawl in coffee producing areas that is now
starting to encroach onto coffee producing land. So I'm thinking specifically of kind of the outskirts of Nairobi, like especially like around to the north of Nairobi, and Nairobi just keeps growing and growing. It's like crazy. Each year you go back, how much more city you need to drive through to get to the farmland. And there's now coffee farms in sort of the Nyeri region, just outside Nairobi, that they're being sold off for housing development. And these are some of the, absolutely best coffee growing soils in the world. And they'll pretty much be paved over for housing. And going back to sort of dichotomies and conflicts and challenges, I adore those coffees. They're basically like the Burgundies of the coffee world, and I'm horrified at the prospect of that land being turned into housing, but it's not my land. It's not my choice to make. If somebody came and made a really good financial offer for the property that we roast our coffee from, and they were going to put up housing, and that ensured financial stability for my family, and generations to come, well, that's a pretty compelling prospect and something to consider. So as much as on one hand I want to say this land should always be farming land and should always be growing incredible coffee, it's not really any of my business whether that happens or not. So, this ongoing cycle of coffee being kind of fraught with challenges and colonial input and being very susceptible to external influence. It's just rife throughout the industry. It can keep you awake at night, that's for sure.
Oh, I mean, honestly, my mind is just swirling with questions and problems and feelings, because I'm sort of thinking, okay, so I definitely need to pay $8 for a cup of coffee so that we can save those lands. But then that also feels, like a really colonial project. It's like, no, from outside, I want to decide what happens on this land. It's so incredibly complex.
Yeah, I think the issue around the price of a cup of coffee is so unbelievably fraught as well, because there's just absolutely no way of knowing how much is going back to where. And I remember your article and how in depth it was, and how it felt like a real watershed that this was being talked about at all, and the part that the cynical part of me felt that there would probably be other less scrupulous coffee operators around the country rubbing their hands a little bit and saying, great, we'd love to see an $8 latte because we can pull $7.75 profit out of that. So yeah, it is one of those unfortunate situations where just paying more doesn't necessarily get you there. You really need to dig deeper into that.
It's just such a different product. If you think about, I can go to my local farmers market and buy, a steak from the farmer who grew the cow, and I can be pretty confident that as I put the money into their hands that, they'll actually be able to put it into their pocket. Of course, but the coffee supply chain is so incredibly complex. I mean, we don't even know if the barista's being paid properly, let alone the person who's, pulling the cherries off the tree.
That's it. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I often look at other industries kind of a little enviously and think, it must be nice to have something that's so cut and dry and you could be so confident in the ethics of. But, I think every industry has its issues, and coffee certainly has its particular set of issues. It just often feels to me like we've got more and they run a lot deeper.
Yeah. Okay, Tim. So
We got heavy really quick.
we got so heavy, but is like that, I think. I mean, we could, you could have similar conversations about other products. Like chocolate is the next one that springs to mind.
Sure.
It's so embedded in our culture, you can't imagine life without it. But my goodness, when you start, start looking into it, it's as fraught, I reckon.
That's a really, sorry, just to touch on that. When you talk about, chocolate being so embedded in our culture, I feel like that's one of the biggest issues that we have around coffee, especially in Melbourne, is we have on the plus side, it is so ingrained in our lives. It's so important. Whenever I talk to friends, stakeholders, partners and stuff all around the world, I talk about what happened in COVID and how everything in Australia got shut down. You couldn't go to funerals, you couldn't go to the gym, you couldn't take your kids to kinder, but you could still get a takeaway latte. And that was the one line that we were never prepared to cross. But that, with that sort of very ingrained nature, we've got the flip side of that, which is really problematic, is that, it feels like part of Australian culture, or a birthright of being a Melbourneite, is that you can get 2 lattes a day and change from $10, and nothing should ever be able to change that. We are so, that very established coffee culture also really keeps us in a bit of a channel where it's very hard to then do what's necessary to improve. And I think that's that other real source of tension that we have in coffee. We definitely don't want to move away from what's made Melbourne coffee so ubiquitous and such an internationally kind of treasured thing. But we also want to make sure that we don't just sit in the perpetual cycle of what's been good from 1985 to 1997 and never develop beyond that.
Okay, I love coffee. I love drinking it. I love going to cafes and having it. I definitely appreciate it, but I will also acknowledge that there is just something extremely problematic about it. But Tim, tell me about Bureaux. This is the company that you've launched in Melbourne. Just tell us what you're up to these days.
So Bureaux Coffee, we actually started back in December 2015. I'd been away living either in London or LA for about 10 years and came back to Melbourne. Wasn't quite sure what the future held or what to do. Came back with my wife, a 2-year-old, and we were 3 months pregnant with twins. So we said, I think we arrived back on December 15th, and December 16th we started the company. And while I sort of like got a bit of a sense of what was happening back in Australia, I wanted to have a business that was fairly flexible, and we actually started Bureau as a roasting collective. So we didn't roast our own coffee under a Bureau brand. We would do collaborations and we would help other people roast. So we actually started out by roasting for Noma when they came here for their residency in Sydney, and they were our first client. And we roasted for them. We started working with a bunch of cafes who wanted to start roasting their own coffee, and we would teach them how to use a roaster, how to source coffee, and then they would rent time on our equipment. And we did that for sort of 3.5, 4 years, but there was always that pull for me to get back into what I'd sort of spent most of my career doing, which was sourcing coffee and then roasting and retailing. So we decided, probably 2.5 years ago, that's where we're going to be moving our future to. And we were slowly working on things in the background and getting all the bits and pieces together. And then COVID hit, and like probably a lot of restaurants or event organisers or anyone around the world who was, service providers. We spent a solid 6 days just taking cancellations and watching the future of the business evaporate. So the other side of our business is an international events company, and that evaporated to zero overnight. And we basically had to pull the trigger on turning Bureau from a roasting collective into a roastery as quickly as we could. So we had some packaging design that we were working on, and we approved it and sent it to print straight away. And we built a online store in about 72 hours and got that live, and started the very long, slow and arduous process of building a roasted coffee brand basically from scratch in the middle of a pandemic. So
wow.
That's kind of what the last year and a half has been focused on, and what we've been doing.
How's it going? Like, is it all right?
I mean, we're still here, so it's we've cleared that threshold. Look, we've been really fortunate that we had a number of relationships that we were able to capitalise on and start doing some wholesale roasting for people that we already had good relationships with. In terms of the scale of the business, like, it's maybe a third of, in terms of revenue, probably about a third of what we were doing previously. The flip side of that, though, I think, is that it's a significantly happier third than when we were on that hamster wheel, sort of really pushing all the time, and really running ourselves ragged to try and rinse every second of productivity out of a day and that kind of thing. I think the business these days and the team these days is in a significantly better place emotionally and as a team, and so that's a really nice part of what's come out of the pandemic for us.
I mean, it's so interesting to hear you say that. I think, I've heard that from other people, that enforced slowdown has actually shown people some differences that they want to hang on to. I mean, is it mostly just about doing less and being less busy, or is there a kind of, something, other sort of intentional changes that you've made and that you wish you stick with?
There's quite a few. I think one of them is not having to travel as much, which has been, I love traveling, but it definitely puts a lot of stress on a family and also on other people in the business. And I think, it can create a bit of a disconnect in a team. So actually being in Melbourne or in Australia for a year and a half stretch, which would never have happened before, that's been a real benefit. So we're being a lot more, I think, deliberate with travel, and I think you're prioritising kind of team cohesiveness over that, just responding to sort of demands of people in other countries that would like us to go and visit. So I think that's something that we are pretty keen to hang on to. And I think just in general, a bit of life balance. Some of that about choosing really judiciously, like what we say yes to, and I guess focusing on work and projects that are going to be things that we enjoy. We're sort of halfway through building a little bakery as part of what we do here at Bureau, and it's definitely not because it's like makes a hell of a lot of financial sense to bake your own bread, but it's a very sort of emotionally nourishing process, and something that the team has been really enjoying being a part of. I think I've certainly really enjoyed everything that we've been learning about the sourdough process and that kind of thing. And it's a bit more, I guess like emotionally nourishing is probably as good a descriptor as I can come up with at the moment. And just sort of things that are tangible, things that are satisfying and rewarding in that sense. We want to really be focusing more on those things.
So when's the bakery going to open? Will it be a retail space or will you be wholesaling?
It'll be retail, yeah. I think we'll probably open it in the new year. We have hit the kind of the challenges of that everyone's hit with building supplies and builder supplies so far. So we've got everything ready to go. We just need to finish changing up some of the way the coffee bar operates in order to be able to display and sell bread and some of those food items as well. So I can't really actually at this point see it happening this side of Christmas, and I plan on taking a bit of time off as well. So I would say it's probably going to be a New Year venture.
Wow, that's something to look forward to. So Tim, we were chatting earlier and you mentioned that you're seeing some changes in the cafe business model. I'm sure you interact with a lot of different cafe owners. Tell me what you've been seeing as people sort of, reframe their businesses in the current landscape.
There's been some pretty huge changes across the board. I think the biggest one that I think is actually probably quite a good thing, from my perspective anyway. Like like yourself, someone who has always loved going to cafes and, basically my entire working life been involved in that aspect of the industry. And it was really interesting spending 10 years as a Melbourne outsider and being somebody who lived away and would come back and visit, periodically. I think it'd be very easy to say, like, if you don't live here, you don't understand what's going on. But I also think you get a really crisp insight into what's happening when you come back periodically, and you can notice those changes in stark relief. And one of those things that I really noticed changing over those 10 years that I was away was that it seemed like the business model of cafes changed, and not across the board, but in a reasonably heavy degree, away from the business model being about making a profit from selling food and drinks to making a profit from establishing a business, building it up, getting a lot of brand traction behind it, and then selling it to someone else. And so it didn't matter so much. Like, you just needed to make sure the books looked adequate, in that 18 months to 24 months that you owned it for. But really, it wasn't about building something for the long term. It was about building something to sell pretty quickly. And I think the bottom has fallen out of that. It certainly looks from the outside like the bottom has fallen out of that. The amount of people who I think had businesses that they were building up with the idea that they would have their payday on the day they got to sell it. The amount of people who I've talked to who have just walked away from those businesses, had keys back to the landlord, salvaged whatever they could in terms of espresso machines, dishwashers or whatever, and then, almost left the keys in the letterbox. I feel like that model has moved away a bit. And I think that would actually be a really great thing for Melbourne and for Melbourne hospitality to get back to really the fundamentals of what hospitality businesses should be, or, in my opinion anyway, which are longer term prospects, which are about building day-to-day trade, not really relying so much on a really big pop of interest when you first open, but really about trying to build things that last. And I think about, a number of the places in Melbourne that do a really good job of that, and how iconic they are, and how I think it would be such a shame if we didn't have any more of those types of businesses coming through. But I do think, thankfully, that the kind of build it to flip it bubble has burst to a pretty substantial extent, and that maybe that is an indicator of a more positive kind of 5 years ahead or so.
It's really, I mean, to me, it sort of smacks of a short attention span, and then people sort of realizing that perhaps that's can be quite shallow and unsatisfying, both for the people who are doing it and for the people who are engaging with those businesses as customers and suppliers. And then, people looking for something that's a little bit more rich and deep rather than, fast and flashy.
Yeah. Well, it must also just be exhausting. Like if the entire model is just about what is going to garner likes on Instagram, or what is going to get a big pop in broadsheet that, means that we're busy for long enough to inflate the books to look good for a sale. It must just be exhausting. But it's also really heavy on resources and waste as well. Like if those fit outs are getting turned over every 18 to 24 months, it just doesn't seem like a really good use of materials or energy. I'd much rather see places that are built to last.
Yeah, so would I. I reckon, you want to believe that it's going to feel nicer to be in those places. Just a bit richer and more authentic.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think there's been a lot of, I guess for my take anyway, like fairly soulless kind of cafe ventures. And I just think that, cafes have always been such a community hub. And, the first place that I ever worked in specialty, it drew me in because from the outside, it was obviously this scene of things going on. And I just had to pull over and find out what was happening.
Where was that?
That was Ray in Brunswick.
Oh, classic.
Yeah. So, that must be 20 years ago. And, it's still there. And, it's probably changed a fair bit over those 20 years. But, it just dripped character and just dripped sincerity, and the amount of alumni from there that have gone on to do really incredible things. Has always been really interesting.
Yeah, well, I mean, that is interesting because like Mark Dundon, who started that, doesn't own it, and it may well have changed hands a few times, I don't know, but perhaps there is something in it. It's not like you start something and you have to like anchor yourself there forever, but maybe it's also about, if and when it does feel like the right time to move on, it's about who you sell it to. And it's those businesses that change hands with almost, it's like passing the baton, then that's really different from, flipping a business sort of in an office somewhere that's really a bit unrelated to the life and the breadth of the cafe itself.
Yeah. Well, I think Ray is a really good example of a place that was there for its neighbourhood and was, simpatico with that neighbourhood in a way that was like really insightful and clever. And so, if you buy it, you don't need to flip it again in 18 months when the next fad comes along, because it runs deeper than that. And I think that's like, I'm a big fan of Hector's, like pretty much everyone else in Melbourne. And if I was Dom, I would just be like walking down the street, just gobsmacked at how many clones there are of that of the appearance of that business showing up everywhere. And, that I think that fad will fade away. But, I would imagine that Hector's will continue. because it's doing what it set out to do, not in response to what everyone else has, gotten notoriety from.
Yeah. Well, I think another thing with Hector's, and I would definitely recommend to everyone go back and listen to my chat with Dom from Hector's a few months ago. So, the South Melbourne store that they've recently opened is so different to the Richmond original, and the Fitzroy store that they're opening next year will be very different again. And I was chatting to Dom recently, and he was just saying, how much time he's spending in other businesses in Fitzroy just to get the feel. And it's not about rolling out a franchise. It's about, responding to each location in a really quite different way. And I think it's very respectful to a neighbourhood when you try to meet it, give it something it hasn't got, but it's in line with the character, or it's knowing the neighbourhood well enough to see the gap.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, that's something we've been really thinking about a lot with the coffee bar and the upcoming bakery in our space, because we're on an industrial side street in Abbotsford. Like, we're straight across the road from the Moondog Brewery, but it's there's panel beaters, there's the brothel, there's this is not Abbot Kinney Boulevard in Los Angeles. It's not, the places that I ran in the middle of Marylebone in London. And so to just take those mindsets and try and implant that here would just be, it's almost insulting, it's just so disconnected from what the neighbourhood wants or needs or is looking for. So yeah, we're trying to be, I guess in a similar way to Dom, be really sensitive to the people who are around us. And what's been astonishing is that we were here for 3 years before we had any kind of retail presence whatsoever. And then when we opened up the doors and started serving coffee, we really managed to get to meet our neighbours. And this was in the middle of the pandemic. And then our neighbours started meeting our neighbours who, they'd been working on the same street for 5 or 6 years and had never interacted because there was no communal focal point in the street. So that's been a really nice thing to be a part of, and part of what we're, I think, trying to keep at the heart of what we do. And that's really informing a lot of decisions around how we do fit outs and how we, what finishes and stuff we use. Because we really don't want this place to be precious. We want if the cyclists from around the corner are coming in and don't have bike locks, we want them to be able to wheel the bikes in and lean them against the wall without, that being, feeling weird or feeling uncomfortable or that kind of thing. So yeah, I think that sympathy for where you are and who you're there for is really important, and just making that cookie cutter, build the Instagram account, get the right colour palette and just drop it into any neighbourhood. I think a lot of people have come unstuck with that recently, and I think more possibly will, and hopefully we just see a bit more of a shift away from it.
So Tim, you mentioned that you have this international events company as part of what you do, and obviously that's had a pretty tough time. Are you able to bring any events back now?
We are. That one's been incredible. So it's a coffee making competition that got started 13 years ago by literally 3 people in a room in Oslo, and they're all brewing coffee on an AeroPress, which, if people don't know, is basically a $50 home coffee maker, a manual coffee brewer. And they wanted to see who could brew the best cup of coffee on that thing, and sarcastically named the event it wasn't even an event at the time, but named it the World AeroPress Championship. And as these things go very occasionally, it just grew and grew. I got on board about 7 years ago to help actually stabilise the thing and make it viable. And we've grown into a worldwide coffee competition. up to 65 countries competing, about 4,500 people taking part each year. And that's if you wanted to like create a COVID super spreader event, like this would be the perfect thing. You bring 750 people from 65 different countries and you put them all into one room, and then you have them all taste coffee from the same bowls and slurp and, interact and then go back to your own countries. So that's the one that disappeared overnight. And we, definitely ended up on a little bit of a wild goose chase with that. We're pretty okay just to kick that into touch for a year while we just worked out what was going to happen. And then we were confident that we'd be able to bring back the World Championship this year. At the times that we had to make the decisions, Melbourne was in a really good position. I'm sure you remember like when we were on top of the world with our COVID response. And
Donut days.
Yeah, exactly. So we said, okay, well, look, the safest place in the world to do this world final will be in Melbourne, and we'll do it in December. And if we can get even 15 countries to host national events, then we'll call that success for the year, and we'll focus on rebuilding again the year after. And then our kind of vaccine thing did what it did, and all around the world we saw vaccine rollouts go really well, everybody opening back up, and we got absolutely flooded with hosting requests from people all over the world. And we ended up, so far, actually, we just booked another one this morning. We've booked 52 national competitions and something like 65 regional competitions happening. So that thing sprang back to well over 100 events happening all around the world. And we had to move the world final in Melbourne because we just weren't going to be able to do it in December. So that has come back in a way that was just astonishing.
That's amazing. But are people going around slurping coffee out of the same bowls?
We have separated bowls now.
Okay.
So there's a COVID safe judging criteria, and we've moved all that to a method that isn't going to be anywhere near as risky. This year is going to be a bit different as well, where the competitors themselves won't be flying in to compete. They're going to be sending their recipe in, and on the day a surrogate barista is going to brew it on their behalf as part of the usual knockout tournament. So,
oh my God, what a responsibility. So
it's going to be huge, yeah.
If people want to keep an eye on this competition, how can they do so?
worldaeropresschampionship.com is probably the best place, or our Instagram account is aero.press. And we're going to be hosting the world final here in Melbourne in March, and we think we'll be able to have maybe 150 to 200 spectators attend, which will be very cool. It'll be, the first event we've done since London 2019, and that's really exciting to have that opportunity to put a little mini coffee festival together and run that competition and get some people in for some food and beer and some coffee and have a good time again.
Awesome, Tim. Well, yeah, that is going to be really special. And yeah, thank you for going deep and wide in this conversation. It's been, obviously you could just talk endlessly about coffee. But thanks for going there, and good luck with getting the bakery up and going. I look forward to coming in for some sourdough and the coffee one day soon.
My pleasure. And thank you to you as well for the podcast series. It's been such a kind of a rock, I think, to listen to and to feel throughout the pandemic to still be connected to a broader, hospitality community. The stuff that you did with Joe Abood, like I worked for Joe back at Rumi, years ago, and it was just so, going back to being emotionally nourishing, it was just so great to hear from other people, to be reminded that those other people are out there and that they're going through difficult things as well. So, it was just a great resource, and I'm sure many people in the coffee and hospitality industry more broadly have really relied on it. So, it's a commendation to you for pulling it together.
Well, thanks so much for the kind words, and I'm glad it's played that role for you. That's a privilege, so thank you. All right. Take care, Tim. It's been fantastic to have you as part of this ongoing conversation.
Cheers. All the best.
See ya. This is Dirty Linen, and I'm Dani Valent. We air the issues that the hospitality industry finds hard to talk about, hearing from different people with unique perspectives. We want to hear from you as well. If you have something that needs to be said about a topic, get in touch so we can include your perspective. Contact us at dirtylinen@deepintheweeds.com.au or hit us up on Insta @dirtylinen podcast. We can't wait to hear from you.